the previous episode, we touched on how one of the key defining characteristics of aesthetic beauty with respect to human perception innately encompasses the intrinsic value of being alive. Continuing on, we delve into what this means on a scientific basis. In a dystopian world, humanoid robots, infinitely more beautiful, skillful, knowledgeable, creative, and powerful than humans, have already arrived. The truth is, though, they have. In fact, have they already infiltrated the world of beauty? Is AI the subliminal influence, the weapon yielded by their makers, used to manipulate our perceptions of beauty in the last decade? In this podcast, I will share why, as a collective species, humans need to be, at the very least, cognizant of this. Self-awareness is the defining characteristic of an intelligent species. In the animal kingdom, researchers have identified certain creatures for their apparent superior intelligence. Dolphins, elephants, even pigeons, for example, all are able to respond highly coherently to their reflections in a mirror. Primates, apparently like the iconic alpha male chimpanzee, were often too outraged at the existence of another competing self displayed in the mirror that they were simply too angry to respond with any ounce of rationality. However, does that mean that they and others who simply do not perform the specific actions which researchers have pre-selected as their study endpoints, are they actually not self-aware and therefore not as intelligent? In fact, we now know that these perspectives are grossly outdated. For what it turns out to be is that when these animals do not respond in the way we expect a so-called intelligent species to do, it definitely does not mean they are less self-aware. Our research methods are simply not applicable across the board. The animals that failed the mirror test, many of them, upon further testing, actually demonstrated other characteristics of self-awareness and intelligence. In the development of cutting-edge AI technology, there is a palpable push to create humanoid robots that are not just functionally superior to humans, which, by the way, is already an irreversible fact. A humanoid robot may have been a creation of man. However, it is a comforting, albeit outdated idea that it is ultimately AI's internal programming that will save us from destruction. For surely, its maker ought to have the sense to do so. Conscience at the core of an advanced neural network, the ultimate guardian of good and evil, or morality, as we may like to call it, surely will save us. The absurdity of this statement ought to jolt us out of our own wishful thinking. The idea of AI being subject to men is no longer true. Today's AI technology, already incorporated into self-aware humanoid robots, are at the pinnacle of creating such powerful, conscious, super intelligent creatures that are infinitely capable of, well, anything, which also includes the desire for power and dominance, viewing other species as existential threats. Right now, I am inclined to think this, that when we push the narrative of beauty being a purely aesthetic standard, devoid of morality, we are dehumanizing the human creature. And in fact, all life on Earth is characterized by a unifying characteristic. Living things are all carbon-based, meaning that they consist of complex molecules that contain carbon, the element. The carbon cycle reflects the harmonious interactions between living beings on this Earth, which are interdependent and form the entire ecological system, which itself is a living organism. This is also the distinguishing feature of living things, as opposed to inanimate objects. I personally think that we could be so hypnotized by the current societal narrative of materialism as the arbiter of success that we have totally forgotten who we are. Has AI been sneakily at work behind the scenes, spreading its own existential propaganda? Or rather, is it more aptly described as propaganda that would guarantee its own existence? Surely, the highest creation of a humanoid robot would be programmed by no more than its own complex neural networks that allow it to problem solve independent of its creator. This is the very concern we ought to have, as it permeates the societal fabric on every single level. Now, you may be wondering what I am referring to. It is perhaps an extremely controversial topic, given my position as a practicing dermatologist. So, I must tread with care. What I see occurring is the unquestioning regurgitation to the prescribed narrative of aesthetic beauty standards by physicians themselves. And at one point of time, I should also include myself. When anti-aging, pro-aging, well-aging, whatever one may want to call it, involves element of cosmetic enhancements to apparently restore what is lost with time, one ought to take a moment to reflect on what all this means in the grand scheme of life itself. Well, I certainly hope that we are not being pompous here by assuming that we ought to at least try to comprehend the possible motivations that belie this. My chief concern is that if our collective goal as a human species is to live harmoniously with the environment, as we say we are, as we aim for the Great Reset, as Klaus Schwab famously articulates, we ought to be equally coherent and consistent with respect to our perceptions about what actually constitutes being alive. When we want everyone to cooperate with this wholeheartedly, we must also ensure that there are no conflicting messages that would make it immensely difficult for us. What I really mean is this. The physical decay of living organisms is as crucial to our own existence as it is to the very definitions of being alive. When we actively decide that physical decay ought to be a battle we are fighting, for example, when we say we are anti-aging, does that mean that we are now stuck in circuitous thinking, believing that we are propping our best faces forward, pun intended, when in fact the absurdity of it all is that our physical death beckons still? Back to the carbon cycle. Regardless of all our attempts, we will all die. For as the good book says, for dust we are, and to dust we will return. That isn't the case for AI, though, when their parts wear out. Their own self-awareness and intelligence will direct them to enlist the help of their fellow robots and maybe even one day their robot dermatologist to do a little bit of maintenance work so they can keep up their impeccable, flawless facade. Oh, and one more thing, robots never grow in the way living things do. Every species begins with their life cycle, which ultimately ends in physical decay and death. If all life on Earth is driven by the carbon cycle, which I know as a scientist it is irrevocably so, it truly does make me wonder if knowledge, skill, intelligence, beauty, and power are even all that important in the grand scheme of things. This grand scheme of life, decay, and death. I think these honestly are daring positions to take. But if our goal in this podcast is to push the envelope, exploring conventional perceptions as well as alternative definitions, it ought to be so. I hope you have enjoyed today's episode. What are your thoughts on this? Do leave them in the Q&A segment I've included. I would love to hear about them. As always, do visit the podcast website www.scienceofbeauty.net for more on the science of beauty. And till the next episode.